If you're still awake, there's probably a reason. This is Boring History Nights, where history doesn't speak loudly, but long enough to hush the dark. You didn't come here for answers, maybe not even for sleep, maybe just to be somewhere soft. The stories don't push. They float like candle ash in still water, turning even memory into something dim, something gentle. The air doesn't move. Somewhere, a chair creaks, or maybe it's just your breath brushing the quiet. Dust lingers mid-fall, as if history paused. Whatever warmth you carried, it wouldn't have lasted the night. Let's not stretch this too fast. If something about this quiet spiral makes the night pass easier, you can subscribe, only if you'd want to hear the next one drift by. And if you're still awake, say where the night found you. I read them all, even the ones that don't remember how they got here. Now let the dark stay dark. Let whatever follows arrive slowly, like it's always been here. You don't have to keep up. Just listen. This is Boring History Nights, and you're already inside it. She never saw the crown, but she paid for it. The cradle didn't rock softly in Alexandria. It was more of a political stage than a nursery swaddled, not in lullabies, but expectations no child should inherit. Cleopatra VII was born into the house of Ptolemy, a dynasty so soaked in betrayal that it could barely float above its own ambition. Incestuous, treacherous, and Roman-dependent, her family resembled a worn-out script of endless plotting and suspicious deaths. But the baby girl that emerged from all this wasn't just another name carved on a temple wall. Not yet. Her name meant glory of the father, a cruel irony. Considering her father Ptolemy XII, Auletes was a man whose own rule relied more on bribing Rome than governing Egypt. Some nights, he paid senators to stay in power. Other nights, he fled the city entirely. But Cleopatra, small and faint in her early years, watched. She wasn't the loud one. She listened. She learned how power didn't roar. It murmured through back rooms, through quiet nods and soft smiles that meant survival. Imagine growing up surrounded by stone corridors that never echoed your footsteps. You learn to move dimly, like a secret. You become skilled in the faint spaces between attention and avoidance. Cleopatra was no different. She didn't conquer rooms, she slipped through them, leaving questions instead of footprints. Her education was anything but gentle. Tutors trained her in mathematics, rhetoric, astronomy, and philosophy, but more importantly, in tongues. She would grow to speak at least 9 languages fluently, including Egyptian, which none of her royal family had bothered with for centuries. The others clung to Greek as a badge of superiority, but she softened her voice to meet the Nile in its own dialect. She became the first of her line to do so, and that was the first sign she wasn't like the rest of them. That was how the story of the Cleopatra biography began, not with seduction, not with war, but with stillness, study, and an ear attuned to things others didn't bother hearing. By the time her father died and left his throne to her and her younger brother, she already understood that rulership didn't wait for you to grow into it. It demanded you become hollow enough to carry its weight immediately. At just 18, Cleopatra was queen, in title, but power. That was a different kind of inheritance, because her brother was only 10, and more a puppet than a partner. His advisors hungry, faceless, afraid of her mind, began whispering for her removal. She didn't shout. She didn't storm. She vanished not from the country, but from the conversations. The coins still bore her face. The documents still carried her name, but behind the scenes, the shadow thickened. And when push finally came, when the court pushed her out, forcing her to flee Alexandria entirely, she didn't wail or mourn or shatter. She gathered what remained, found allies in the desert, and plotted. She would return not with an army, not yet, but with a plan rooted in something even older than war timing. You wonder sometimes if the beginning of a legend should feel louder, but often it's quiet. It's a woman, alone in exile, writing letters to men who think they own the world. It's a lantern flickering in a half-buried temple, beside a woman mouthing strategies to herself. It's her asking softly, who do they fear more, a girl with nothing or a girl with time? The faint hum of survival isn't dramatic, but it lasts. Meanwhile, Rome, the eternal city, was already beginning to fray at its seams. Julius Caesar, hungry for control, was at odds with Pompey, his one-time ally, now enemy. The Republic rattled under the weight of ambition, and Egypt's instability had become a pawn in their power struggle. When Pompey fled to Egypt after losing the civil war, Cleopatra's brother's faction thought it wise to assassinate him. Presenting his severed head to Caesar like a macabre welcome gift, Caesar did not thank them. Instead, he wept, or pretended to, and in that moment, one of the many contradictions in Roman performance, Cleopatra saw an opening. If Caesar could mourn a man he fought, perhaps he could forgive a queen who had been cast aside. But she couldn't simply walk back into Alexandria, so she curled herself in a carpet, not metaphorically, literally. The plan, if one could call it that, was to smuggle herself into Caesar's chambers rolled inside a rug, a ploy that sounds ridiculous, perhaps even comedic. But it worked, because while they expected fanfare or force, she gave them softness and surprise. When the carpet unfurled, what stepped out wasn't a damsel or a threat. It was something fainter, a queen, barefoot, exiled, glowing with intent. Caesar wasn't prepared for her, but then again, neither was history. And just like that, she wasn't a girl without a throne anymore. She was a presence in the room where Rome decided the world's fate. She had returned not by storming the palace gates, but by becoming the silence between decisions, the pause that made men question whether they'd already lost. The Cleopatra biography doesn't begin with snakes or suicides. It begins with a hush, with a girl who dared to study the breath between empires. Cleopatra didn't win Caesar with perfume, nor with skin lit by torchlight. She won him with the way she paused before speaking, as if silence might offer better counsel than words. Rome had always seen Egypt as exotic, indulgent, even dangerous. To them, Cleopatra wasn't a ruler, but a curiosity, a whispered story told by sailors who returned from Alexandria with more wine than truth. But Caesar, hardened by war and weary from betrayal, looked at her and saw something different, a mind sharpened not by books alone, but by surviving betrayal in a court that devoured its own. He didn't fall into love. He walked toward it slowly, in that calculated Roman way, one hand still on his ambition. But Cleopatra wasn't walking toward him in the same direction. She had her eyes on something older than Caesar the Nile, the throne. The strange line between myth and survival that Egypt demanded from its rulers. Their alliance wasn't just passion, it was an exchange of mirrors. Caesar needed legitimacy after a civil war that left Rome frayed and suspicious. Cleopatra needed a champion powerful enough to reassert her rule and rid herself of her brother's encroaching grip. In many ways, they used each other. But perhaps it's more accurate to say they allowed themselves to be used like two stones, sharpening one another in slow, deliberate turns. She returned to Alexandria not as a girl hiding in shadows, but as a woman at Caesar's side. Her brother was stripped of power, and before long, stripped of life itself, his body vanishing in the Nile like so many threats that became soft legends. Cleopatra was no longer co-ruler. She was ruler. Unapologetically, undeniably. That year, Egypt did not just regain its queen, it regained its pulse. Trade routes opened, taxes were restructured. Even the priests, long skeptical of the Greek-speaking Ptolemies, found themselves whispering prayers in her name. Her voice, still and slow, had begun to echo. And then there was the child that Caesarion, as the Romans would later call him, was born in the spring. Though there are no lullabies to record the day, his birth meant many things, none of them simple. For Cleopatra, he was an heir, a symbol that Egypt could remain sovereign through blood as well as politics. For Caesar, he was a secret he would never acknowledge publicly, though everyone understood. Historians still debate whether Caesar truly loved her or merely admired her utility. Some point to the golden statue he erected in her honor at the Temple of Venus Genetrix, a quiet declaration in a city that did not permit loud affections from men of state. Others argue that Caesar's failure to name Caesarion as his successor suggests distance, a reluctance to entangle Rome's legacy with an Egyptian queen and her foreign child. But history often reads emotion through the lens of outcomes, not intentions. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the hollow space between power and memory. And even then, Rome began to murmur. Cleopatra's presence in Caesar's life was too visible, too symbolic. When she visited him in the capital, walking the streets in fine silks, and with Caesarion in tow. It stirred something old and uneasy in the Roman soul. They feared queens who moved with purpose. They feared Egypt's softness, not for its weakness, but for its patience. And patience, they were learning, could be more dangerous than rage. The whispers in the Senate grew louder. Caesar's power was growing too fast. His association with Cleopatra, a foreign woman, a monarch, and a mother of his rumored son made him appear less Roman, more king-like, and Rome had killed kings before. Still, Cleopatra stayed. Perhaps she thought Rome could be softened, or perhaps she believed Caesar's hold on power was strong enough to shelter them both. If so, she was wrong. He was assassinated in the Ides of March, and with him, the fragile future they had begun sketching in the dim corners of empire. Caesar fell on the Senate floor, stabbed by those who once called him friend, and Cleopatra, far from the forum, far from the knives, suddenly found herself standing beside an invisible grave. She didn't stay in Rome. She slipped away, slow and quiet, back to Alexandria, to her palace, her child, and a kingdom suddenly more exposed than ever. No Roman protector, no buffer. Just the silence that comes when the wind changes and all the maps begin to lie. For a while, Bob, she ruled alone again. And she ruled well. Egypt, under her hand, wasn't just surviving, it was reasserting itself. She invested in science and trade, restored temples, and kept the grain flowing to Rome, which was still starved and spinning in the wake of Caesar's death. She kept her voice dim but present in Roman politics, especially as new factions began to rise, most notably one led by a man who was as loud as Caesar was calculated. Mark Antony. He arrived like a thunderclap brash. Theatrical, dripping with a kind of charm Cleopatra had seen before but never trusted. Still, the times were changing. The empire no longer tilted toward Caesar's memory. It bent now toward new ambitions. And Cleopatra, ever the strategist, understood that to be alone in a shifting Rome was to be vulnerable. So she invited him, and this time, the seduction wasn't in carpets or symbols, it was in the feast. When Antony arrived in Tarsus, Cleopatra didn't approach him as a widow or a supplicant. She sailed up the Cydnus River in a barge decorated with gold, silver, and purple sails. She came as Isis, as myth, as sovereignty wrapped in scent and performance. She spoke to his hunger not just for pleasure, but for legitimacy, for spectacle, for something that felt like legacy in the making. Historians like to argue over whether it was love at first sight. Some say he fell too easily. Others say she planned every glance, every phrase, every delay. But what matters more is that when they met, the world shifted again softly, but irrevocably. Because now, it wasn't just Cleopatra against history. It was Cleopatra and Antony a pairing that would echo through centuries of operas, poems, and quietly disappointed kings. Together, they weren't merely lovers. They were a political fuse waiting to be lit. And Egypt for now was alight. The Cleopatra biography flows like the Nile, sometimes wide, sometimes narrow, but always bending back to the same truth that even power, when spoken gently, can be heard across empires. In Alexandria, the evenings grew longer and the corridors of the palace grew quieter. Cleopatra and Mark Antony had not simply become lovers, they had become a symbol, not just to the citizens of Egypt, but to the fractured minds of Rome. Together, they crafted a shared mythology not through declarations or public ceremonies, but through the slow and deliberate weaving of image and story. Cleopatra positioned herself as Isis reborn, the divine embodiment of Egypt's ancestral spirit. Antony played his part as Dionysus, a figure of war and wine, torn between destruction and beauty. The lines between strategy and passion blurred with each passing season, and though many later accounts reduced their relationship to a cautionary tale of lust and indulgence, the truth may have been quieter and far more calculated. There was an understanding between them, not always spoken, but clearly drawn. Cleopatra offered Antony legitimacy in the East, access to wealth, ships, and grain. Antony, in return, offered her a foothold in the only empire that still threatened Egypt's sovereignty. Together, they ruled as twin flames, not because they shared the same vision, but because their needs were momentarily aligned and their ambitions, however fragile, had found a temporary peace in one another's presence. They built a world of their own in Alexandria, elaborate festivals, philosophical salons, and a court where poets and scholars mingled with generals and emissaries. But beneath the surface of those celebrations, something deeper stirred. Their children Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene were not just heirs, they were declarations. Each child represented a potential empire that did not yet exist, but that might, someday, if Rome could be bent just enough to allow it. Still, Rome watched, back in the West. Octavian Caesar's adopted son and eventual heir seethed. Antony was not just a rival, he was an insult. While Octavian strengthened his power base through careful alliances and calculated restraint, Antony had disappeared into Egypt's soft embrace. The Senate, increasingly loyal to Octavian's vision of Rome, began to mutter that Antony was no longer Roman at all, that he had become a shadow, blurred by silk and incense. Cleopatra, aware of the murmurs, did not flinch. Her power had always existed in the quiet margins of empire, not through overt defiance, but through presence. She did not send messages to Rome pleading for acceptance. Instead, she invested in temples, funded trade expeditions, and appeared alongside Antony at public ceremonies with calm, deliberate poise. Even as rumors swelled, she remained exactly where she had always been, in the still center of a widening storm. There was a night not recorded in marble or manuscript, but passed down through oral fragments, where Cleopatra stood alone on the palace balcony, watching torchlight shimmer across the bay. Below her, Antony had gathered his men. They were feasting, laughing, spilling wine in memory of old victories. She watched them without speaking, her face faintly illuminated by the soft glow of the brazier. What thoughts crossed her mind that night will never be known, but one might guess they had less to do with passion and more to do with what always follows feasts: debt. Egypt, under Cleopatra's rule, remained prosperous, but war was expensive. The alliance with Antony, while emotionally and politically significant, also came with costs. Rome had not grown tolerant, only momentarily distracted. And with each new child, each new public gesture, Cleopatra and Antony made themselves more vulnerable to the myth-making machine Rome had perfected over centuries. Their love was not just a scandal, it was now a threat. Antony, for all his bravado, began to show signs of wear. He returned to Rome briefly, married Octavian's sister in an ill-advised political maneuver, and then abandoned her soon after returning to Egypt with even more gossip trailing behind him. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, did not confront him with fury. She didn't need to. She had long since learned that loyalty could be coaxed better through quiet understanding than confrontation. Together, they returned to their dream, one that now felt slightly more hollow. Though neither would admit it, they founded new territories, named the twins rulers of imaginary kingdoms, and staged ceremonies that were more symbolic than sovereign. These acts, though dramatic, revealed a tension. Their vision of the future was not built on present strength, but on the idea of what could be reclaimed or imagined into existence. Rome, under Octavian, was not built on imagination. It was built on order, fear, and control. The divide was no longer just between two men or two political factions. It had become philosophical. Rome was tightening, becoming colder, more calculated. Egypt, under Cleopatra and Antony, was blooming in a way that felt ancient, artistic, and soft in the eyes of a militarized Senate. It was a dangerous softness, the kind that could make a people question why obedience had to be sharp and loud. Octavian, sensing opportunity, seized on that contrast. He released propaganda painting Cleopatra as a foreign seductress who had bewitched Antony and turned him against his homeland. She was no longer a queen, she was a sorceress, a manipulator, a threat to Roman masculinity and order. And in this carefully orchestrated campaign, Cleopatra was cast not as a leader, but as a shadow wrapped around a fallen Roman. It didn't matter if it was true. Rome had never required truth to raise a sword. And so, the drums of war began to thrum softly at first, like a heartbeat beneath velvet, then louder, closer, inevitable. Cleopatra prepared as she always had, not with panic, but with precision. She and Antony fortified their fleets, stockpiled resources, and positioned themselves at Actium, a coastal city where sea and sky held the line between dream and reckoning. As the ships gathered, the wind over the Mediterranean turned slow and hollow. The sky dimmed with the promise of something final. Their forces were numerous, but divided. Rumors of desertion whispered across the ranks. Even among allies, fear had begun to spread like a thin veil across loyalty. Still, Cleopatra stood beside Antony, not behind, not beneath, but beside. Because in the end, even if the war would be decided by iron and fire, she understood that the soul of it was much softer than Rome could ever admit. And so the sea waited, and the sails fluttered, unsure, and the pass soft, still. And watching breathed its slow wind through the rigging. If your eyes are fading, let them. The story wasn't waiting for anyone. The Battle of Actium was never meant to feel final. Even in the days leading up to it, there was an air of postponement, as though both sides were waiting for the other to flinch first. The sea swelled under a gray September sky, windless and heavy, and the ships sat like chess pieces trapped in a game neither player fully believed they would win. Antony, commanding from his flagship, was increasingly surrounded not by loyalists, but by those who hesitated. Cleopatra, positioned with her own fleet nearby, watched the horizon with an expression that, even centuries later, has been described as unreadable. War at sea is not always the dramatic spectacle poetry makes it out to be. There is shouting, yes, and steel against wood, but also long hours of standoff, waiting, repositioning, watching the enemy's oars dip in and out of the water in soft, repetitive rhythm. There's time to think, too much time, and for Antony and Cleopatra, that time may have been their undoing. Many Roman sources, shaped by Octavian's pen and later Augustus's historians, claim that Cleopatra fled at the height of battle, pulling her fleet away in a moment of cowardice or panic. But those stories are built atop layers of propaganda, and historians have long debated whether her maneuver was retreat or strategy. Some argue she was attempting to preserve the remainder of their navy, knowing that Antony's cohesion had already crumbled. Others suggest a prearranged escape, coordinated between the two, when the tide of war had clearly turned. What matters more than speculation is the silence that followed. As Octavian's forces closed in, Antony's fleet fragmented, discipline eroded, and loyalty wavered. By nightfall, many ships had surrendered or burned, their hulls sinking slowly into the Ionian Sea. Antony, disoriented and betrayed by what felt like abandonment, eventually followed Cleopatra's lead, retreating from the waters that had once promised him dominion. They returned not to glory, but to the dim corridors of Alexandria, a city that now felt too wide for them. The people welcomed their queen with caution. Love still lingered. But so did fear. Egypt had withstood many rulers, but rarely one whose fate was so intimately entangled with a losing foreigner. Antony, once a figure of Roman might, now wandered the palace like a man haunted not by enemies, but by echoes. The halls where he once laughed grew quiet. His presence faded into routine, and his old charisma, once the anchor of every room, dissolved into something slower, heavier, more hollow. Cleopatra, however, did not vanish. She resumed her role not just as a lover or a mother, but as a sovereign. Even in the wake of collapse, she continued diplomatic outreach, arranged for the protection of her children, and explored last efforts at negotiation with Octavian. Her mind did not retreat the way her navy had. If anything, her focus sharpened. The soft clarity of imminent loss has a way of revealing one's true capacity for control. There was still one card left to play. Caesarion. The child she had once hoped would unify Rome and Egypt had now become a potential threat to Octavian's claim as Caesar's sole heir. Cleopatra understood this. She knew that in a game of succession, legitimacy was not determined by blood alone, but by survival. She quietly sent Caesarion south, toward Upper Egypt and perhaps beyond, hoping to shield him from what was coming. Whether she believed he would one day return and reclaim something of her legacy, or whether she simply wanted one thread of her story to remain uncut, we will never know. Meanwhile, Antony fell deeper into himself. He attempted to rally troops. He tried, briefly, to rekindle the fire of rebellion, but the political climate had shifted, and so had he. The loss at Actium was not just tactical, it had pierced his identity. No longer a general, no longer a favored son of Rome, he became something unfamiliar, a man who had once held the world's attention, now reduced to pacing empty rooms with no one to impress. The end came slowly, then all at once. When Octavian's forces finally reached Alexandria, the city did not erupt into chaos. There were no glorious last stands, no streets soaked in defiant blood. Instead, there was an overwhelming stillness. Antony, told that Cleopatra had taken her own life, fell on his sword in a dim chamber, a final act of Roman honor. Though even that came misaligned. She had not died. The news was false. He bled, slowly and with great pain, only to be brought to her side as he faded. And there, in her arms, he died not on a battlefield, but in the hushed twilight of a woman's private sanctuary. Cleopatra, watching him slip away, did not cry out. If she spoke, the words have not survived. All that remains is the image of her holding him as the world outside shifted again. One empire ending, another taking shape. Octavian did not burst into the palace with cruelty. He came with a kind of cold efficiency. He met Cleopatra. He spoke with her. Whether he saw a grieving woman or a dangerous queen still calculating beneath the surface is unclear. But he allowed her to live temporarily. She was to be taken to Rome, paraded as a captive in his triumph. Her presence, bound and foreign, would cement his victory not just over Antony, but over the chaos of the Republic itself. She would be a trophy, one more silent figure hauled through Roman streets, surrounded by cheering citizens who had never known her, only feared what she represented. But Cleopatra had no intention of becoming anyone's artifact. Within days, she arranged her final act. The details remain hazy, as they always are when myth and history begin to entwine. Some say it was a venomous asp, smuggled in a basket of figs. Others say poison, carefully hidden in a hairpin. Regardless of the method, her choice was deliberate. This was not despair, it was design. She dressed in her finest robes, adorned herself with the symbols of Isis, and lay upon her bed, as still and composed as the statues that had long tried to capture her likeness. There, in the soft hush of fading empire, she left not with a cry, but with a whisper. Even in death, she remained sovereign. And the world so loud in its judgment, so eager to possess her memory, was left holding only her shadow. If you've started slipping out of it, keep going. The past barely noticed you were here. In the aftermath of her death, the silence she left behind was deafening. Octavian entered Cleopatra's chambers not as a conqueror bathing in glory, but as a man stepping into a space that had already swallowed its last occupants. The room smelled faintly of incense and unburned oil, the air still holding the warmth of a ritual completed just hours before. Her attendants, loyal to the very end, had either followed her into death or sat frozen in quiet grief. There was no spectacle, no final curse scrawled on the walls, just her composed, pale, still regal even in death, as though daring Rome to reduce her into anything less than sovereign. The official record would later describe her demise with theatrical simplicity. Cleopatra, the foreign queen, unable to live without her Roman lover, chose to take her own life in romantic despair. But that version, shaped by Octavian's narrative machine, served a purpose. Rome could not allow her death to be understood as a political act, nor could they tolerate the idea that she outmaneuvered their final act of triumph. So instead, they turned her into myth, not the living kind she had fashioned, but the defeated kind Rome preferred. A woman undone by love, a storybook ending that made her safe. Yet even in her final act, Cleopatra had asserted control. Her death, if anything, denied Octavian his moment. She had removed herself from his victory parade, escaping the humiliation he had prepared, and thus robbed him of the one image that might have rivaled Caesar's glory or Antony's legend. What he received instead was a kingdom stripped of its queen and a history that would forever circle around the space she had just vacated. Egypt became a Roman province in the quiet that followed. Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, solidified his place not just as ruler, but as the founding figure of the Roman Empire. He secured the grain routes, reorganized the administration, and ensured no rival lineage would challenge him. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, by Julius Caesar, had been captured during his attempt to flee. At only 17, he was executed not publicly, not ceremonially, but efficiently. His existence had become a liability, a threat to the fragile illusion of imperial continuity. No monument marks where he fell. Cleopatra's children by Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were spared, taken to Rome, and raised under the care of Octavia, Antony's former wife and Octavian's sister. Their presence in Rome was a quiet reminder of the tangled alliances that had once defined Mediterranean politics. But they were no longer heirs to anything. Whatever dreams had been stitched into their names now faded like old embroidery. Beautiful but functionless. And yet Cleopatra's absence did not empty her story. It deepened it. Because while Rome buried her as a warning, history would not let her rest there. For generations, writers and rulers alike would return to her name, reinterpreting, romanticizing, reshaping. She would become a vessel for every cultural anxiety and aspiration. To some, she represented feminine power gone too far. To others, she was a symbol of resistance, a woman who dared to lead, to negotiate, to fight, and finally, to choose the terms of her exit. Over time, paintings turned her skin lighter, her clothes more revealing, her features more European. Playwrights made her tragic, seductive, almost naive. Operas cast her in arias of desperation and devotion. Every generation seemed to remake her into something they needed a muse, a monster, a martyr. But the real Cleopatra, the woman who ruled Egypt for over 2 decades, who navigated shifting alliances with intelligence and precision, remained elusive. And perhaps that was her final strength. The Cleopatra biography, when viewed without ornament or distortion, is a study in persistence. Born into chaos, she ruled through uncertainty. Her court was a shifting sea of ambition, jealousy, and foreign threat. And yet she maintained stability, invested in infrastructure, protected culture, and defended autonomy longer than many believed possible. She did not inherit peace, she manufactured it, day by day, decision by decision. Even when the weight of empire pressed harder than most could endure, her intellect was not a myth. Contemporary accounts, even from hostile Roman sources, acknowledged her education, her multilingual fluency, her command of court ritual and legal matters. She was not beautiful in the simplistic, aesthetic way often portrayed in art. Rather, her allure stemmed from presence, the way she listened, responded, and understood the room better than anyone else in it. Beauty, for her, was a tool, not a foundation. It served a strategy. It never replaced one. Even her love affairs, legendary as they are, were not impulsive choices of the heart alone. They were political alignments in a world that punished female autonomy and survival. Her bond with Caesar allowed her to reclaim her throne and secure Egypt's independence for nearly 2 more decades. Her alliance with Antony, though ultimately doomed, extended that independence until Rome's inevitable transformation swallowed every rival in its path. But none of that means she was cold or devoid of feeling. The human heart does not exclude strategy. Cleopatra may have loved deeply, but she did so in a context where love could not be separated from consequence. To care for someone in her position was to weigh not just the emotional gravity of affection, but the geopolitical weight it carried. Every gesture, every whispered promise, bore the burden of inheritance and the risk of downfall. That she managed to hold these contradictions, ruler and lover, mother and myth, intellect and symbol, speaks less to magic and more to the depth of her reality. She was complex not because history made her so, but because she lived in a world that refused to allow her simplicity. And still, across centuries, her story echoes. Not loudly, not sharply, but slowly, like a faded breath between ancient columns. You might imagine her, not in the height of power or in her final hours, but in the middle, walking through the palace gardens just after dusk. The stone paths warm beneath her feet, the scent of tamarisk in the air. She moves quietly, not because she fears being overheard, but because power does not need to announce itself. It shapes the space around it, like water filling a basin, soft, still, inevitable. That was Cleopatra. Not the caricature, not the cautionary tale, but the sovereign who learned how to rule by listening longer than others could bear, by studying what silence revealed, and by refusing, even in her last breath, to be reduced to someone else's ending. To truly understand Cleopatra's reign is to confront the layers of tension she managed with a deliberate steadiness that few rulers, male or female, ever mastered. Her Egypt was not the Egypt of pyramids and pharaohs, of gods sculpted into sandstone or armies that thundered across the desert. By the time Cleopatra came to power, Egypt was no longer the world's epicenter, but a jewel set in someone else's crown, vulnerable, watched, and increasingly drawn into the gravity of Roman politics. And yet, under her, it pulsed with a quiet defiance. Governance, for Cleopatra, was not just survival. It was an act of reclamation. She inherited a throne weakened by generations of internecine struggle and economic dependency on Rome. And yet she found ways to reassert Egypt's agency, not through rebellion, which would have ended swiftly, but through reinvention. She revitalized agricultural systems, ensuring grain exports remained steady even during Roman upheavals. She funded religious institutions across both Upper and Lower Egypt, which helped legitimize her among native Egyptians who had long viewed the Ptolemaic dynasty as outsiders. She navigated these fractured identities, Macedonian in lineage, Egyptian in ritual, with such skill that she became one of the few Ptolemies to actually be embraced by both Greek-speaking elites and Egyptian clergy. Her palace became a center of scholarship, echoing the legacy of the once magnificent Library of Alexandria, now damaged by decades of war and neglect. She welcomed mathematicians, philosophers, linguists, and physicians not as ornaments of court life, but as essential to the longevity of her regime. Knowledge, in Cleopatra's world, was not a luxury for the elite. It was infrastructure. It held things together. And through this investment, she reinforced Egypt not just as a source of grain or gold, but as a mind among empires. But none of these achievements made her safe. For every reform she implemented, every alliance she nurtured, Cleopatra also had to contend with the reality that her position rested upon perception, both within Egypt and beyond its borders. She could pass decrees, but the tremor of Rome's ambitions could still undo them. She could command armies, but the politics of intimacy, particularly her relationships with Caesar and Antony, meant that her personal life was always entwined with national fate. It is easy, from a modern distance, to question the wisdom of those relationships. Why tie herself so visibly to Roman men, especially when those men, though powerful, were deeply entangled in their own fragile games? But such judgments ignore the structural limits Cleopatra faced. Egypt, despite its storied past, had become a client kingdom. The Roman Republic, and later, the empire, held the resources, the legions, the diplomatic sway. Without a Roman alliance, Cleopatra's reign would have been short and easily erased. And so she played the role available to her, not passively, not foolishly, but with full understanding of the risks. Her liaisons with Caesar and Antony were not about capitulation. They were strategies wrapped in proximity, soft power in a world that only respected hardness. She gave these men what Rome could not, legitimacy shaped through intimacy, through mystery, through the subtle performance of a world beyond their own. In exchange, she secured political leverage, at least for a time. Still, power rooted in romance is always precarious. It seduces and destabilizes in equal measure. With Caesar, Cleopatra had achieved a unique, if temporary, status, bearing his son, living briefly in Rome, observing the Republic's internal chaos, but his assassination shattered that arrangement, and her return to Egypt marked the beginning of a period that was both expansive and increasingly fraught. The years between Caesar's death and the rise of her alliance with Antony were years of strategic recalibration. She focused on infrastructure, maintaining economic independence as much as possible. She leveraged Egypt's natural wealth, its papyrus, grain, and artisanship to remind Rome of her country's indispensability. And yet, the ground beneath her was never fully stable. Rome was changing, Octavian was rising, and the rules of engagement were shifting with each new political realignment. When Antony re-entered her life, he did so as both a familiar face and a volatile variable. Unlike Caesar, who was known for calculation and control, Antony carried the aura of a man who burned through certainty. He was charismatic, yes, but also erratic, vulnerable to impulse, and shaped by contradictions he could never quite reconcile. Cleopatra must have known this, and yet she still made the alliance, perhaps not because she trusted his consistency, but because she recognized that in a world ruled by ambition, emotional clarity was a luxury no longer available. With Antony, Cleopatra found both opportunity and danger, and perhaps even moments of genuine connection. But if there was love between them, it lived in the same house as power. Their bond created children, ceremonies, territories, and also enemies. The Cleopatra biography begins to loop itself here, repeating themes of trust, betrayal, control, and the slow erosion of autonomy that comes not from single moments, but from a series of small, nearly imperceptible losses. Even before the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra must have sensed that the tide was turning. Her court grew quieter, more deliberate. Advisors no longer spoke as freely. The future no longer stretched out like a map, but curled in on itself, vague and soft-edged. And yet, she persisted not blindly, not stubbornly, but because to retreat entirely would be to invite Rome to write her final chapter for her. There's a kind of courage in continuing to govern, while surrounded by encroaching ruin. That courage is rarely praised. History likes its heroes to be triumphant or tragic, not sustained by slow resilience. But Cleopatra's power was not forged in spectacle. It lived in quiet decisions, quiet corrections, quiet refusals to fade. She did not raise her voice when Rome condemned her. She simply stayed where she was and let the world arrive at her door. In this phase of her reign, the Cleopatra biography intersects most profoundly with questions of historical agency. How much of her fate was chosen? How much was imposed? Could she have navigated differently? Or was the architecture of empire always going to collapse inward the moment she became inconvenient? Historians still debate whether this was a matter of survival or something far more symbolic. Cleopatra remains difficult to categorize, not because her record is incomplete, but because her life resists easy narratives. She was not merely a figure of romance, nor simply a ruler fated for tragedy. She was a strategist, a linguist, a mother, a monarch. She was often surrounded by louder voices, but hers was the one that lasted, not in volume, but in persistence. And now, as you trace her story once more, you realize that the faintest voices, the ones that move through rooms without disturbing the dust, are often the ones still breathing centuries later. Alexandria, in the final years of Cleopatra's reign, no longer resembled the luminous city it had once been under her ancestors. The streets remained active, the harbor still bustled with commerce, and the golden-tipped Pharaoh's lighthouse continued to guide ships from distant shores, but the city had grown inward as if holding its breath. The grandeur remained, but it had softened around the edges, and Cleopatra herself seemed to move through its palaces and temples with a gravity that came not from authority alone, but from weariness worn beautifully. Leadership is rarely a sustained high. It is repetition. It is waking before others, making decisions no one sees, and maintaining calm in the face of mounting, invisible weight. For Cleopatra, the years after Actium marked not only the slow unraveling of her political fortunes, but also the sharpening of her inner resolve. Though Antony grew increasingly unpredictable and Rome's shadow grew longer with each passing season, she did not crumble into despair or abdicate her role. Instead, she leaned into the tools that had always sustained her intellect, her poise, her silence where others would have shouted. During this time, Cleopatra turned her attention not only to matters of state but to memory, to how she would be remembered, to what might remain of her world if her kingdom were to fall. She commissioned temples along the Nile in traditional Egyptian style, with her own image carved beside the gods, inscribed not as a foreign ruler, but as a daughter of Isis, as pharaoh in her own right. These monuments were not vanity. They were declarations, not to the Rome that might crush her, but to the river and the sand and the people who had whispered her name into the dark long before coins had been minted or ships sent west. Her children, too, became part of that strategy. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were not raised as ornaments of courtly life, but as potential leaders, living symbols of a dynasty that had not yet yielded. She involved them in ceremonial duties, exposed them to diplomatic meetings, and began to project a narrative that suggested continuity, not collapse. While Rome spun tales of decadence and decline, Cleopatra offered a vision of endurance of a mother preparing her lineage not for a fall, but for survival beyond defeat. And yet, behind the ceremonies, there was a quieter effort at control. She restructured Alexandria's bureaucracy to favor Egyptian traditions more strongly than before. She reached out to priests from Thebes and Memphis, restoring their funding and consulting them on regional concerns. She knew the symbolic power of these alliances. They tied her more closely to the older dynastic legacy of Egypt, even as the Roman world attempted to paint her as an outsider, as a figure of indulgence rather than of statecraft. These choices weren't merely cultural gestures. They were a kind of defensive magic, not in the mystical sense, but in the political one. She was surrounding herself with symbols that could outlast defeat, with narratives rooted deeper than Rome's current ambitions. It's in these years that the Cleopatra many have tried to imagine truly lived not as a seductress or a tragic heroine, but as a ruler faced with impossible odds and still unwilling to yield completely. Her palace became quieter, yes, but more focused. Her voice did not raise itself to match Rome's noise. Instead, it slipped underneath, slow and steady, a low current beneath all the pomp and rhetoric. Some nights, when the wind turned warm and the Nile reflected only a sliver of moonlight, she would sit on the rooftop of the palace, wrapped in soft linen, and watch the torchlight flicker across the city's sprawl. From there, she could see the canals curling through the neighborhoods, the unfinished temples lit like forgotten prayers, and the distant mass of foreign ships lingering in the harbor. That view had changed so little since her girlhood, and yet now it held the dull ache of things she could not protect. Still, she did not flee. Though the prospect of Roman conquest became more likely with each passing month, she remained not out of delusion, but out of responsibility. She knew Egypt's people were watching her, perhaps more now than ever before. The way she carried herself in public, the manner in which she addressed court petitions, and even the way she moved during religious processions became messages, not of denial, but of determination. She was not preserving her image. She was preserving theirs, their memory of sovereignty, of culture, of lineage not yet broken. It is here that one must pause and consider how endurance can be misread as denial. Many accounts, particularly Roman ones, portray Cleopatra in these final months as obstinate, as clinging to illusions of power already lost. But this reading misunderstands the nature of resistance. She did not resist because she thought she could win. She resisted because surrendering would confirm every foreign assumption ever cast upon her throne. And beneath that resistance, a more fragile truth trembled her understanding that this was, perhaps, the last generation of Ptolemaic rule. She could still smile for the statues, pose beside her children in carefully staged reliefs, and speak calmly in the council chamber. But in her quieter hours, she must have wondered whether any of it would last, whether the Nile, for all its length and memory, would carry the sound of her name into a future where Rome had already begun to write in stone. A reflective interlude settles here. Not everything was meant to be remembered all at once. Some things must be carried in pieces, like wind through broken columns or footsteps across worn tile. These were the years when the Cleopatra biography stopped being a story of rising and became one of preservation. A queen not trying to expand her empire, but to keep its soul intact. A mother raising not heirs to thrones, but witnesses to what was lost. A woman increasingly aware that history, if it did remember her, would do so through the filter of her enemies. And still she stayed. Not because she believed the ending would change, but because she refused to let it arrive too easily. If your breath has disappeared into the dark good, that's where the rest of this belongs. There is something uniquely haunting about the final months of a world that knows it is about to end, not with catastrophe, but with slow erosion. In Alexandria, during those last twilight days of Cleopatra's reign, that sense was palpable. The rituals continued. The court maintained its rhythm. Taxes were collected, prayers offered, diplomatic messages sent and received. But under it all, there was a dim vibration, like a string pulled too tight, humming just beneath the threshold of speech. The quiet dread of inevitability. Rome was no longer just a threat waiting on the horizon. Octavian's advance had transformed it into a shadow stretching across the palace floors. Cleopatra's spies reported his movements with increasing frequency and detail, each message carrying with it the silent burden of dwindling time. What had once been distant speculation had hardened into fact. He was coming, not just to punish or to conquer, but to finish. In that climate, leadership demanded a kind of steadiness that transcended hope. Cleopatra did not rally troops in desperation or retreat into the solitude of mourning. Instead, she entered what could be called her most paradoxical state, both preparing for war and rehearsing legacy. It was during this period that she made the clearest effort to define her myth. She did not aim to outlive Octavian militarily, but to outlast him symbolically. That meant reasserting the sacred in her image. She visited the great temples at Dendera and Philae, presenting offerings not merely as ruler, but as living deity, not performative gestures to please crowds, but calculated reinforcements of an idea that Egypt was not merely territory, and she not merely its administrator. She was Mayat, the principle of order, balance, and justice. And in a world now tilting violently toward Rome's cold efficiency, that role became her final anchor. The city responded in kind, priests and scribes, many of whom had served generations of rulers before her, redoubled their loyalty. They recorded prayers in her name, invoked her in local rituals, and committed her lineage to the scrolls that would be buried with the dead and read in the afterlife. It was a soft kind of resistance, not against weapons, but against erasure. Even outside the temples, Cleopatra continued governing, with Antony's presence diminishing, both in physical strength and public influence. She took more direct control over administrative decisions. Trade was maintained as long as possible. Internal uprisings were preemptively calmed through negotiation rather than force. The royal court became not a site of pageantry, but of preservation, where each decision felt like an attempt to write the ending herself, instead of having it written for her. There is something unbearably human in this effort, to recognize that the story is ending and still insist on shaping the punctuation. Historians sometimes fail to capture this moment with the reverence it deserves. They shift quickly to Rome's final campaign, or Antony's disintegration, but in doing so, they miss the quiet dignity of a woman arranging the last pieces of her world not as denial, but as gift. Amidst all this, the presence of her children remained central. Cleopatra Selene, in particular, now nearing adolescence, began to assume greater ceremonial duties. Her mother ensured that the girl was seen, was heard, was recognized by the people as a continuation of something older than invasion. Alexander Helios, though less documented, was given similar treatment dressed in royal regalia during processions, his name invoked in state-sponsored hymns. The children were not hidden from the public eye. They were woven more tightly into its gaze, not as targets, but as promises. Fragile, yes, but deeply intentional. Antony, meanwhile, grew quieter. The once celebrated Roman general, known for his bold speeches and theatrical posturing, now moved through the palace like a man unraveling from the inside. He attempted to keep up appearances, holding military reviews, receiving foreign envoys, but his presence had lost its previous weight. Whatever spark had once made him magnetic was now buried under failure, humiliation, and grief. He had become a relic in his own court. Still, Cleopatra did not push him away. She allowed his decline to unfold beside her without resentment or spectacle. Their conversations became shorter, their strategies less confident, but their connection remained intact in a way that suggests something beyond political alliance. In a world falling inward, sometimes the mere act of staying present becomes its own expression of loyalty. If he could speak across time, perhaps he would whisper, "I didn't know how to stay strong, but I stayed close. That was all I had left." As Rome approached, negotiations began cautiously, indirectly, often through envoys or intercepted messages. Cleopatra, knowing Octavian's intentions, made one final attempt to protect what could still be saved. She proposed handing over the kingdom peacefully if her children were allowed to live and retain some form of dignity. The offer was not one of desperation, but of diplomacy. She was not asking for clemency for herself. She had already calculated her position too well to expect that. Octavian responded. Eventually, with characteristic clarity, he promised nothing. He welcomed surrender. Yes, and perhaps even hinted at leniency, but only if Cleopatra submitted fully, completely, and became part of the spectacle he was preparing. It would be her final performance, but not one of her choosing. And so, the curtain began to fall. In the last weeks of her life, Cleopatra turned inward. She met with priests in her private sanctuary. She oversaw the careful wrapping and burial of sacred artifacts. She consulted with astronomers, not to predict victory, but to understand the shape of endings. There was no frantic resistance, no dramatic plea, just a series of small, precise actions that suggested acceptance not of Rome's judgment, but of time's quiet hand. At night, the palace was still. Torches burned low. Conversations slowed to murmurs. The servants moved with reverent care, as if afraid that even the sound of a misplaced step might accelerate what was already approaching. In that hush, one can almost hear the weight of every decision Cleopatra had ever made, circling her like soft echoes, reminding her that no one is remembered by how they lost, but by how they remained until the end. What if forgetting was never failure, just a softer way to hold weight? There is a moment in every unraveling when the thread no longer holds tension. It doesn't break with a snap, nor fray visibly at first glance, but instead begins to loosen, to slip quietly from the spool, unnoticed until it has already unraveled more than it should. For Cleopatra, that moment arrived not with an army at her gates, but with the silence between messengers, the hours that stretched too long between reports, the absence of certainty where there had once been control. Rome, she knew, was now closer than her breath. Octavian's forces entered Egypt with the efficiency of a machine that no longer needed ceremony. They did not burn temples or destroy homes. That kind of conquest was unnecessary. What they brought instead was something far more chilling: the normalization of victory. They made it clear that Alexandria would not be reduced, merely absorbed. Resistance would be tolerated only until it ceased to matter. This was not war. It was annexation wrapped in the language of inevitability. Within the palace, Cleopatra did not retreat into drama. She did not hold court in mourning robes or surround herself with lamenting followers. Instead, she continued to govern with the poise that had defined her entire life. Orders were given, records were kept, guests were still received with formality. Even as Octavian's emissaries arrived with veiled threats and insincere reassurances, she met them with calm language, expressing neither submission nor delusion. She spoke as a queen who knew the value of posture, even when the ground beneath her was dissolving. Antony, however, had drifted too far into despair to maintain such composure. After a series of failed military maneuvers, abandoned allies, and miscommunications, his confidence had evaporated. When he was falsely informed, that Cleopatra had taken her own life, the last remnant of his will collapsed. He fell upon his own sword, missing the heart, collapsing in a pool of his own blood, not instantly dead, but dying slowly, painfully, in the hollowed echo of what once was Rome's finest general. They carried him to her, injured, gasping, broken in spirit and body. He was brought into the mausoleum. She had begun preparing for herself a structure meant to preserve a kind of majesty. Even in death, Cleopatra, upon seeing him, did not scream or fall into theatrical grief. She took him in her arms, steady and silent, and held him as he died. There is something in that moment more than tragedy, more than theater. It is intimacy that transcends the noise of politics. Not passion as spectacle, but care stripped down to its most essential form presence. After Antony's death, Cleopatra knew her time was measurable not in weeks or days, but in gestures. She had no illusions about Octavian's intentions. Whatever words his envoys delivered, they carried the scent of performance. He would not spare her, not as a monarch, and certainly not as a symbol. He needed her as a message, one more conquest. Paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, so that he could elevate himself from victor to empire founder before the eyes of his people. That kind of death slow, public, symbolic, was unacceptable to Cleopatra, not simply for reasons of pride, though pride no doubt played a part. It was about sovereignty. To be marched through the forum was to be rewritten. To allow herself to be exhibited was to surrender not her body, but her narrative. Everything she had done, every alliance, every compromise, every risk had been a negotiation for control, and to lose that control at the very end would be to undo the entire arc of her life. So she arranged for her final act. We cannot know the precise details, though historians have filled the silence with guesses. The asp in the fig basket, the poison in the hairpin, a vial hidden in a comb. Each theory offers something convenient, but the truth remains just out of reach. What we do know is that she chose the time, the place, the attire, and the witnesses. She dressed in her royal garments, white linen, gold jewelry, adorned in symbols of Isis, and laid herself upon the ceremonial couch within the mausoleum. She was found there later, beside her two most loyal handmaidens, all three already gone or slipping beyond the reach of waking. Even in death, she managed control. Octavian, arriving too late to stop her, was not pleased. Her death denied him the moment he had spent months preparing. There would be no Cleopatra to parade through Rome. No ultimate humiliation to cap his rise to supremacy. All that remained was a body carefully positioned, devoid of panic, and a city subdued not by force, but by the silence she left behind. It is in this aftermath that her story becomes most susceptible to distortion. With Cleopatra dead, Octavian moved quickly to shape the narrative. In his version, she was emotional, unstable, driven to despair by the death of her lover and her lost ambitions. This framing served him. A queen undone by love was less dangerous than one who chose death as an act of final sovereignty. The former could be pitied. The latter might be respected. And yet, over time, pieces of the truth leaked through. The logistics of her death, so clean, so precisely arranged, resisted the narrative of helplessness. Her final days had not been spent wailing or pleading, but preparing, directing. Rehearsing the last lines of a play she refused to let Rome write for her. Her children had been protected as far as she could. Her treasures had been accounted for. Her temples sealed. Her silence complete. What remained was myth, but a myth laced with reality that no conqueror could fully erase. The Cleopatra biography doesn't end with her death. It extends into the centuries of interpretation that followed, in which her memory was carved and recarved by poets, historians, painters, and playwrights. Rome tried to fossilize her into failure. Later generations made her into a seductress, a siren, a shadow. But beneath all those projections, a quieter version persists, one of strategic depth, emotional resilience, and unwavering autonomy. Her legacy is not preserved in marble or gold, but in the questions that refuse to resolve. How much did she know? How much did she intend? What would she have become had she been allowed to live, not as a trophy, but as a partner in history? Perhaps it is better that we never find out. Some stories gain their power not from answers, but from the shape of the silence they leave behind. You're not here to understand, just to notice the dust it left behind. In the quiet that followed Cleopatra's death, Alexandria did not fall into flames. It did not erupt in civil unrest, nor did it crumble under the weight of grief. Instead, what we see, the city exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though it had been holding its breath for so long that it no longer remembered what it meant to breathe freely. The people resumed their routines with a muted efficiency, not because they did not mourn her, but because her departure had not come as a surprise. They had seen the signs, the increasingly closed doors of the palace, the temple processions that lingered longer than usual, the sudden solemnity in the voices of market vendors who once hummed the queen's praises while arranging their goods. Octavian assumed control with the calculated steadiness of a man who had long rehearsed this role. He did not need to demonstrate brutality. His power lay in precision. Egypt was declared a Roman province, placed under the authority of an equestrian prefect rather than a senator, a deliberate gesture to ensure its wealth would flow directly into the imperial coffers, untouched by Rome's traditional elite. Octavian understood what many of his peers had not. Egypt was not just territory. It was a vital artery in the empire's body, and control over it would guarantee more than food. It would guarantee power. Yet despite his efficiency, something eluded him. Cleopatra's death had not provided the emotional triumph he expected. Her body lay in the mausoleum, embalmed according to Egyptian tradition, her name carved into stone with reverence. The people still spoke of her softly, as one speaks of a departed relative who had once defied odds. And they did not weep in public, but neither did they forget. Even Octavian, soon to be Augustus, sensed the dissonance. He had won the war, but the woman he had sought to reduce into a symbol of excess and failure had managed to vanish on her own terms, leaving behind not scandal, but reverberation. And so he redirected the narrative. In Rome, Cleopatra was not mentioned by name at first, in speeches and inscriptions. Octavian emphasized the defeat of Antony, the fall of Eastern decadence, the restoration of Roman virtue. Cleopatra, whose presence had shaped the previous 2 decades of Mediterranean politics, was intentionally blurred into background. When she did appear in retellings, it was always through the lens of moral instruction, a warning, a cautionary figure, a seductress who had led great men astray. Her intelligence was downplayed, her political acumen ignored. What remained was an outline, a figure in soft focus, defined more by her proximity to male ambition than by any sovereignty of her own. That silence imposed, curated, and reinforced through art and text is perhaps the most telling aspect of her legacy, because it is not the silence of absence, but the silence of discomfort. The empire had trouble explaining her without explaining itself. Cleopatra had ruled effectively, diplomatically, and with enduring loyalty from her people. She had withstood the pressures of internal factionalism, external dependency, and imperial aggression. She had done so while navigating personal relationships that carried enormous risk. And most of all, she had refused to become a passive figure in the narratives others crafted for her. Over time, that refusal became harder to ignore. In the centuries that followed, her image resurfaced, reshaped again and again, but never fully erased. The Cleopatra biography began to migrate from the realm of official histories into the space of art, theater, and legend. In Shakespeare's hands, she became a creature of passion and poetic chaos, a woman whose love for Antony destroyed empires. In paintings, she was rendered pale, mysterious, often reclining amid fabrics and fruit. In opera, her voice soared in high tragedy, caught between fate and desire. Each depiction reflected more about the age that produced it than about Cleopatra herself. And yet, in every version, something of her original presence remained. The gaze, the poise, the sense that she was always choosing, even when it seemed she had no choice. Today, we sift through those representations with a mix of admiration and skepticism. Scholars uncover fragments of papyri, temple inscriptions, coinage bearing her profile, and through them, we see glimpses of the historical woman behind the myth, a ruler who spoke multiple languages, who authored policy documents, who negotiated with empires, who survived coups and exile, and who ultimately died not in weakness, but in defiance. The fact that she ruled for over 20 years, in a period defined by volatility and imperial expansion, is itself a testament to her capability. Few of her Roman contemporaries lasted as long. Her reign did not just survive, it adapted. It negotiated. And it maintained a degree of sovereignty in a world where power was constantly slipping from smaller states into the hands of an increasingly centralized Rome. One might ask, what would Cleopatra's legacy have looked like had she been Roman? Would the chroniclers have treated her differently, not as a siren, but as a stateswoman? Would her relationship with Caesar have been described as diplomacy rather than seduction? Would her decision to die rather than submit have been framed as noble instead of dramatic? It is difficult to say, but what is clear is that gender, culture, and colonial tension all shaped how her memory was sculpted. Even now, when her name appears in textbooks or in popular conversation, it is often attached to phrases like the last pharaoh or the lover of Antony and Caesar. But those are titles she did not choose. And they reflect only a fragment of who she was. They do not capture the nightly briefings she conducted with her advisors, the ceremonial protocols she designed to bridge Greek and Egyptian traditions, the economic decisions that kept Egypt from famine, or the way she corrected foreign emissaries who misunderstood local customs. If anything in this stayed behind, you can leave something below, or not. It still counts. This was Boring History Nights. We remember Cleopatra not because of the men who loved her, but because of the silence she carved into empire, a silence that resisted simplification, a silence that asked gently, persistently to be heard differently. If history were honest, it might admit that Cleopatra was not an anomaly, but a mirror. She reflected Rome's contradictions, its obsession with order, its fear of autonomy, its inability to comprehend a woman who wielded softness as a form of power. She did not roar, and that unsettled them more than any army. And perhaps that is the most enduring element of her biography, not the tragic romance, not the palace intrigue, but the realization that soft power, when wielded with precision and restraint, is often more threatening than brute force. She did not need to shout. She merely needed to remain. As time lengthened and the Roman Empire solidified its rule across the Mediterranean world, Cleopatra's image became more elusive and paradoxical, a presence that refused to fully vanish, even as it was continually reshaped by those who had never met her. Generations passed, and with them, the memory of who she had truly been grew more obscured, buried beneath layers of reinterpretation. Yet despite the distortions, her shadow lingered in the corners of collective imagination, not because Rome preserved her with honor, but because they could never fully silence her. The Cleopatra biography continued, not through records alone, but through whispers, persistent, quiet, scattered like seeds in forgotten soil. In the schools of Alexandria, some tutors still referred to her as the last queen, invoking her not with scorn, but with reluctant awe. In the temples where the old gods had not yet been abandoned, Her name occasionally joined those of the divinities, not as an intercessor, but as a symbol of what had been lost, a woman who once walked beside deities without asking permission. Meanwhile, in Rome, the portrayal remained calculated. The public version of Cleopatra, the dangerous enchantress. The foreign manipulator was more than a slander. It was a safeguard. Octavian, now Augustus, had claimed to restore order and moral clarity to Rome, to justify the civil wars, the assassinations, and the quiet descent from republic to empire. He needed antagonists who embodied everything Rome feared it had become. Cleopatra fit this role too perfectly to discard. She was not merely defeated, she had to be blamed. Yet, even within that narrative, cracks began to form. Writers, especially those in the following centuries, could not help but return to her with curiosity. Plutarch, who lived more than a century after her death, wrote of her not as a fool or a temptress, but as a woman of extraordinary intelligence, charm, and deliberate intention. His account, though still influenced by Roman bias, preserves something of her agency, something that other sources had tried to erase. He described her wit, her linguistic dexterity, her ability to adapt herself to any situation or audience. She became, in his pages, not just a figure of drama, but of control. And as those stories filtered outward, into Byzantine and Islamic scholarship, so on, into the Renaissance, into Enlightenment salons, and colonial museums, Cleopatra continued to transform. Each age found something different in her. To some, she was a cautionary tale. To others, a tragic heroine. To still others, a symbol of female authority both admired and feared. Her image never settled, because it was never allowed to rest. But what remained constant beneath all the reinventions was a kind of stillness, the echo of someone who had spoken carefully, moved deliberately, and acted with more foresight than her conquerors wished to admit. That stillness, faint, soft, slow, persisted, not because it was loud, but because it had been real. If one were to walk through the ruins of ancient Alexandria today, there would be no grand statue of Cleopatra standing amid the columns. Her palace, believed to have stood on what is now submerged land, has left few visible remains. The sea has taken much of it, not in a single wave, but in the gradual, hollow erosion of centuries. Yet divers have found remnants, bits of sculpture, fragments of ceremonial columns, coins bearing her profile, small pieces, quiet in their own right, but significant for the way they defy oblivion. It is in these details, the curve of a cheek etched into bronze, the faint trace of an inscription on limestone, that we begin to feel her again, not as a legend, but as a person. A woman who lived in a specific time, with specific responsibilities, hopes, and fears. A woman who sat at a desk overlooking the harbor and signed documents that affected thousands. Who walked through temple courtyards with the weight of ritual pressing gently against her shoulders. Who woke each day not as a myth, but as someone who had to govern a complicated, fragile world. Some nights, that weight must have felt unbearable, not because she lacked strength, but because strength, when carried constantly, becomes less about heroism and more about endurance. It is the weight of knowing that every choice you make, every alliance, every policy, every delay will not only be judged by your contemporaries, but rewritten by those who come after. Cleopatra lived under that pressure for more than 2 decades. And in that time, she rarely faltered. She never abandoned her post. She never abdicated. Even in her final hours, she negotiated, positioned, and made decisions designed to protect what she could from what she could not stop. Perhaps that is why her legacy endures, not because she conquered Rome, but because she refused to let Rome decide what kind of queen she had been. If none of this is making sense anymore, you're exactly where you should be. There are lives, that end abruptly, and others that taper like smoke, not extinguished, but gradually dispersed until only their scent remains in the fabric of memory. Cleopatra's life was the latter, though her death was deliberate, even theatrical in its construction. What followed was less an epilogue than a long diffusion of her presence into cultures that both feared and needed her. In this way, her biography did not stop. It scattered. Long after her death, when Augustus had settled into his reign and the city of Rome had reshaped itself into the marble epicenter of imperial power, Cleopatra's image remained a point of tension. The Senate avoided her name in formal orations. Statues of her were not erected in the Forum, nor were temples commissioned in her memory. She had been too much, too clever, too foreign, too female. To remember her properly would require Rome to confront the discomforting truth that she had nearly outplayed them. And so the official channels remained silent. But silence, as history often teaches, is not erasure. Instead, her memory migrated. It moved into personal letters, into the private libraries of philosophers and poets, into the stories told by women in marketplaces who still recalled the procession of her barge, sails perfumed and purple, when she had first come to Tarsus. It clung to the crevices of Roman architecture and Egyptian stonework, where inscriptions still bore her name, stubbornly resisting the Roman preference for obliteration. By the 3rd century, as the Roman Empire began to fracture under its own weight politically, economically, spiritually, Cleopatra reappeared in a new form. Christian writers, eager to paint the Roman past as decadent and misguided, reached for her image as a symbol of worldly temptation. In their hands, she became the embodiment of sin beautiful, manipulative, and ruinous to righteous men. Antony's downfall was no longer a political miscalculation. It was recast as the punishment of a man seduced by a pagan queen. Cleopatra's intellect, her policy reforms, her cultural diplomacy, all of it vanished behind the veil of allegory. And yet, even these distortions kept her alive. Through the medieval period, she appeared again in Arabic literature, not as a seductress, but as a philosopher queen. In texts like Kitab al-Fihrist, she was remembered as a scholar, a practitioner of alchemy, a woman of science and wisdom who preserved the knowledge of the ancients. This depiction, radically different from both Roman and Christian narratives, spoke to an understanding of Cleopatra that had survived through the region's oral traditions and had been reframed through the lens of intellectual legacy. In these accounts, she was not dangerous because she was beautiful. She was dangerous because she knew too much, because she spoke too clearly, and because she refused to relinquish authority to men who thought her mind a threat. Later, during the Renaissance, as European scholars began rediscovering the classical world, Cleopatra re-emerged once more. But this time, she became a kind of mirror. To artists, she represented sensuality and power. To playwrights, most famously Shakespeare, she embodied contradiction, regal and reckless, commanding and impulsive, human and larger than life. His Antony and Cleopatra rendered her in sweeping emotional color, not entirely historical, but deeply evocative. The tragedy wasn't just in her death, but in the impossible balance she tried to maintain love and politics, empire and identity, vulnerability and performance. Still deceived, this renewed interest in her did not bring resolution. The more she was studied, the more elusive she became. Historians debated the color of her skin, the shape of her face, the precise nature of her voice. Artists painted her in contradictory ways, sometimes fair, sometimes dark, sometimes modestly adorned, sometimes drowning in silk and gold. No single image sufficed. No definitive portrait could be agreed upon. And so, once again, she slipped through the fingers of those who tried to grasp her fully. There's a strange kind of power in being impossible to define. while most figures from antiquity are flattened into statues or summaries. Cleopatra continued to exist in tension between admiration and suspicion, between historical record and imagined excess. Every culture that approached her saw something different, and in doing so, revealed more about its own anxieties than about the woman herself. Even in the modern era, Cleopatra's image has remained contested. Films have tried to pin her down, most famously with Elizabeth Taylor's lavish portrayal, a version of the Queen more reflective of 1960s Hollywood glamour than of first-century Egypt. Scholars and activists continue to argue over her ethnicity, her origins, the implications of her portrayal in both Western and African histories. Some see her as a proto-feminist icon. Others view her as a symbol of empire's decay. Still others try to extract the historical facts from centuries of embellishment to return to the woman behind the myth. But perhaps such efforts, though noble, miss something essential. Cleopatra's legacy may not reside in any single narrative, but in the space between them. She survives not because one version of her triumphed, but because no version ever managed to claim her completely. She remains a contradiction, and in that, she is deeply human. The ruins of her Egypt have not vanished. The temples she commissioned still hold her carved image. The scrolls she preserved through patronage helped shape the intellectual currents that fed both the Islamic Golden Age and the European Enlightenment. The coins bearing her face continued to surface in archaeological digs, weathered but legible, reminders that she once ruled a land where gods spoke in stone and queens in many languages. And in those small, tactile remnants, metal pressed with her profile, stone shaped with her titles, she speaks again, not in loud proclamations, but in faint echoes. A presence that endures not because it has been shouted across time, but because it has been whispered, gently, again and again. Even now, when you walk through a museum gallery and see her name, when you pause at an inscription or study a faded fresco, there is a kind of hush, as though the past is asking you not to believe the simplest version of the story, as though it is asking you to listen more closely, more patiently, and to allow the quiet to do its work. If you've started slipping out of it, keep going. The past barely noticed you were here. If there is a tragedy in Cleopatra's life, it is not that she lost, for in the strictest sense, all rulers eventually do, but that she has been remembered so inconsistently. Her defeat, unlike those of her Roman contemporaries, was followed by centuries of distortion, commentary, and theatricality, much of which bore little resemblance to the decisions she made or the world she occupied. And yet, within that distortion, something remarkable happened. She was never forgotten. Most ancient figures fade not because they were unimportant, but because they were unrecorded, or recorded carelessly. Cleopatra, on the other hand, became too recorded, saturated with meaning, burdened with metaphor. Every era, it seems, felt compelled to repurpose her life into something that would serve a new narrative temptation in one century, treachery in another, inspiration in the next. She did not vanish beneath history's sand. She became part of the sediment, layered and pressed by time until her image, imperfect, contradictory, yet strangely intact, emerged again and again. But to speak of her only in terms of image is to risk repeating the mistake of those who came before us. What is often overlooked, even now, is the structural brilliance with which she operated. At a time when Egypt was a client state, beholden to the shifting tides of Roman favor, Cleopatra managed to hold the country together through diplomatic nuance, economic foresight, and cultural adaptability. She kept Egypt fed during famine years, maintained control of trade routes across the eastern Mediterranean, and managed internal court politics with a precision that is rarely acknowledged in popular accounts. Her education was not ornamental. Trained in philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and law, she was well versed in the intellectual traditions of both the Greek and Egyptian worlds. her decision to adopt Egyptian religious customs, including presenting herself as the reincarnation of Isis, was not merely theatrical. It was a deliberate act of political legitimacy aimed at bridging the cultural divide between her Macedonian lineage and the Egyptian populace she governed. This was not illusion, but inclusion, a merging of identities that Rome, with its rigid sense of superiority, found deeply unsettling. Even her command of languages is 9. Perhaps more was not an affectation of courtly sophistication, but a vital tool of diplomacy. She could speak directly with emissaries and local governors without needing intermediaries, which granted her not only efficiency, but authority. It is difficult to overstate the power of language in an empire, particularly when borders are porous and allegiances fragile. Her voice, therefore, was not just symbolic. It was strategic. It was a presence that held weight in every room she entered. That presence, of course, was what made her so dangerous to Rome. Not because she was foreign or female, or even powerful in the traditional sense, but because she embodied an alternative model of Rule 1 that did not conform to Roman values of rigidity, hierarchy, and masculine conquest. Cleopatra ruled through fluidity, through soft power, through the long game. Her alliances were personal. Yes, but never solely romantic. Her performances were grand, but never hollow. She understood the politics of perception, and she played them well, not always perfectly, but with far more clarity than her detractors admitted. In that sense, the relationship with Antony was less a romantic tragedy than a final attempt to resist inevitability. Both rulers, one Egyptian, one Roman, understood that their fates were no longer entirely their own. Rome, under Octavian, was becoming an empire in truth, if not yet in name, and it had no room for ambiguity. Cleopatra and Antony represented a model of leadership that was theatrical, hybridized, and defiantly cosmopolitan. Octavian offered something simpler: order through consolidation, peace through obedience. And so, when Actium shattered their alliance and Rome absorbed Egypt, it was not just a territorial conquest. It was the end of a particular way of being, the end of negotiation as strategy, of softness as power, of multiplicity as identity. In Cleopatra's death, Octavian eliminated more than a rival. He eliminated a model. From that point forward, Roman governance would grow increasingly autocratic, increasingly uniform, increasingly Roman in the narrowest sense of the word. But Cleopatra's model did not disappear entirely. It lingered in the way her story refused to conform. In the fact that she was always depicted as more than just an Egyptian queen, in the discomfort she caused in those who tried to pin her down. Even now, scholars argue not just about what she did, but about what kind of figure she truly was. Was she an Egyptian nationalist, a Hellenistic monarch, a globalist before her time, a mother fighting for her children's inheritance? All of these are true, and none of them are complete. Her complexity is not a flaw to be smoothed over. It is the truth of her existence. She inhabited multiple roles simultaneously, and she did so with an awareness that most of us, even now, would find exhausting: to be ruler, woman, lover, mother, symbol, and target all at once is a form of endurance that few can sustain. And yet, she did. In the end, perhaps the best way to understand Cleopatra is not as a woman who lived before her time, but as one who lived in her time more fully than anyone else dared to. She saw the contours of her world with clarity, recognized the dangers, measured the costs, and chose again and again to act, not from fear, but from intention. Her death was not her downfall. It was her final act of authorship. And for that, she remains not just in ruins or relics, but in a whisper that continues to unsettle power, centuries after the empire that tried to silence her has crumbled into dust. In considering Cleopatra's final years from a vantage point outside the myths and distortions, what emerges most clearly is not a woman defined by romance, but one shaped by consequence. Her life was not a series of entanglements with powerful men, but rather a continuous exercise in balancing competing imperatives, political, cultural, personal within a world that was increasingly hostile to ambiguity. She was never afforded the luxury of existing in just one category. Instead, she had to be everything at once: a divine ruler to her people, a strategic partner to foreign powers, a cultural bridge between empires, and a sovereign with agency in a world where female power was tolerated only when it could be contained. The palace she ruled from, now lost beneath layers of sea and silt, was once a place of convergence, geographically situated at the crossroads of East and West, and ideologically positioned at the fault line between tradition and innovation. Cleopatra's Alexandria was not merely a seat of political authority. It was an intellectual powerhouse, home to scholars, artisans, astronomers, and theologians from across the Mediterranean. Within those halls, discussions would have unfolded not just about tax policy or military logistics, but about cosmology, metaphysics, and language. That she fostered such a space, even as her political life grew increasingly precarious, speaks to a depth of vision that has been consistently underappreciated. She understood that power was not only enacted through military force or political alliances, but also through culture, through the stories a civilization told about itself and the intellectual frameworks it used to justify its structures. Cleopatra, more than perhaps any ruler of her era, grasped the symbolic weight of narrative. She crafted her own mythology not in isolation, but in response to Rome's encroaching certainty. Where Rome offered law, she offered lineage. Where they promised structure, she offered continuity. Her embodiment of Isis was not simply a gesture to please Egyptian priests. It was a deliberate statement that her authority was ancient, sacred, and not subject to foreign review. This distinction becomes all the more poignant when one considers how Roman narratives tried to reduce her after her death. Rome required its adversaries to be cautionary. Cleopatra, who had spoken in council chambers, studied texts, debated philosophers, and orchestrated policy, was reimagined as an irrational distraction not because that was what she was, but because it was safer to believe that she had never really been in control. A woman whose choices could shape history was, to Roman sensibilities, less tolerable than one whose charms merely derailed it. Yet even in this distortion, something slipped through. Roman poets could not resist her allure, not just the physical one, but the intellectual and symbolic one. Virgil, writing under Augustus's patronage, hinted at her defiance in the Aeneid, her presence looming over the naval scenes of Actium like a ghost of alternative history. Later writers would expand on this tension, not erasing her entirely, but turning her into an emblem of the costs of ambition, of the dangers of foreign influence, of the tragic grandeur of resistance. She became Rome's haunting, the echo of a choice it could not unmake, and a story it could not control. The truth, however, lay elsewhere, quieter, steadier, more complicated. It lay in the archives of temples that recorded her donations and decrees, in the coins that bore her likeness alongside that of her son, in the tax reforms she implemented to stave off economic collapse, in the policies she enacted to balance the often conflicting expectations of her Greek and Egyptian subjects. It lay in the way she delayed Rome's inevitable annexation, not with armies, but with negotiation, with patience, with poise. These are not the details that inspire grand tales or sweeping cinematic retellings, but they are the ones that hold weight. They reveal a ruler whose understanding of her position was not simply reactive, but profoundly strategic, someone who viewed time as a fabric to be folded and refolded, not a line to be raced down. even in her final act, this understanding remained intact. By dying on her own terms, she denied her enemies the final page they had scripted. She left behind not a conquest, but a question. What if there had been another way? That question lingers, not just as historical speculation, but as a symbolic pivot. Cleopatra's story challenges the neatness with which history often prefers to operate. It resists binary categorization, strong or weak, victim or villain, romantic or rational. She was all of those things at various moments, and none of them exclusively. She was a human being navigating extraordinary circumstances, armed not with certainty, but with insight, intuition, and a relentless capacity for adaptation. What often goes unspoken in the Cleopatra biography is the toll that such navigation takes. To live so consciously, so deliberately, is a kind of burden. It demands the suppression of instinct, the constant reevaluation of trust, the compartmentalization of grief. She bore the deaths of siblings, the betrayal of advisors, the collapse of alliances, and the disintegration of plans built years in advance, all while maintaining the facade of divine stability expected of a pharaoh. It is easy to romanticize such poise from a distance. It is harder to understand the internal discipline required to sustain it. In her final years, as the options narrowed and the Roman threat solidified, Cleopatra must have known that the ground was no longer shifting but sinking. Yet even then, she did not scramble. She planned. She made provisions for her children. She protected her temples. She finalized rituals. She oversaw her own mausoleum's construction. These acts were not signs of despair, but of determination, a last effort to give structure to what would come next, to ensure that even in defeat, her legacy would retain its shape. And in many ways, it did. Despite centuries of reconfiguration, Cleopatra remains distinct among ancient rulers. She has no equal among her contemporaries in terms of cultural reach, narrative complexity, or symbolic depth. Alexander conquered more, Caesar built more, but Cleopatra, she remained present in a way that few ever manage. She did not disappear into victory or dissolve into failure. She persisted, transformed, multiplied. Perhaps this is why she continues to invite new tellings. Each generation rediscovers her, not simply out of fascination, but because she offers a lens through which we can examine power, gender, identity, legacy, and the tension between appearance and reality. She is not just a figure from the past. She is a question we keep asking, a story we keep retelling, because it still has not resolved itself. And maybe it never will. By the time Cleopatra entered the final phase of her reign, she must have known that the odds of enduring in the form she had so carefully maintained were slipping further from her grasp. The momentum of history, which had once allowed her to ride its tides with calculated grace, now threatened to consume the very stage on which she stood. Rome was no longer just an external force, it had become an inevitability, a structure of power so vast, so deeply embedded in every corner of the Mediterranean, that no alliance, no negotiation, no lineage could stand untouched by its approach. Yet even then, Cleopatra did not flinch from the work of rulership. Her attention remained fixed on the mechanisms of her court, on the ceremonies that marked time, and on the infrastructure that kept her city alive. Alexandria still functioned as a cultural lighthouse, a beacon not just of trade or scholarship, but of autonomy. The grain still moved through its harbors. The scholars still gathered in its halls. The temples still rang with prayers offered in her name. She did not dismantle these structures in anticipation of loss. Instead, she continued to reinforce them not as illusions, but as defenses, tangible and symbolic, against the erasure she understood too well. In those final months, the presence of her children took on a greater significance. Not merely because she loved them, though that may certainly have been true, but because they represented continuity. Their very existence challenged Rome's narrative that Cleopatra had been nothing more than a disruption, a distraction in the grand project of imperial expansion. In her children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, she projected a future that was not Roman. It was hybrid, global, and defiant. She knew, of course, that their futures were not guaranteed, but to prepare them, to position them in rituals and in public life, to show them beside her in ceremony, was to insist that they mattered, and that Egypt, in some form, could still endure through them. There is a particular form of hope, reserved for those who know they will not witness its fulfillment. It is the kind of hope that guides actions not for their immediate effect, but for their symbolic residue. Cleopatra understood this. Her decisions in those waning days were not about short-term victories. They were about preserving the possibility that something might survive not undamaged, not triumphant, but remembered with clarity. Rome's interest in Egypt was never cultural. It was logistical. The Nile, with its predictable flooding, was a source of grain more reliable than any within Italy. Its wealth, its gold, its exports, these were prizes to be claimed, not traditions to be preserved. Octavian had no interest in the soft layers of Egyptian ritual, nor in its complex cosmology. To him, Cleopatra was not a spiritual figurehead or an intellectual force. She was a political problem that had finally resolved itself. But to the people of Egypt, and to those in Alexandria who had lived under her rule, the contrast between how she was seen and how she had ruled could not have been more pronounced. Still, once Rome declared victory, the city shifted, the military presence increased, the language of governance changed. The statues of Caesar and Antony, which had once stood in strategic places of honor, were removed or defaced. Cleopatra's own effigies were left in place, but they were no longer active objects of devotion. They became curiosities, the remnants of a time officially declared finished. Alexandria did not revolt. There was no uprising. The silence of the population, like so many silences in history, was not an endorsement of conquest, but an acknowledgement of futility. For Cleopatra, whose life had been defined by deliberate action, such a quiet aftermath must have been haunting. She had tried to script every moment, even her exit, and in some ways, she had succeeded. Her death, meticulously arranged, denied her enemies the closure they desired. It forced Octavian to contend with a legacy that would not present itself for display, her children. Though eventually scattered into the Roman world, carried fragments of her image. Cleopatra Selene, raised in the household of Octavia, would go on to become Queen of Mauritania, a ruler in her own right, albeit under the shadow of Rome. The line, though dimmed, had not been fully extinguished. If history were measured not by triumphs, but by resilience, then Cleopatra's reign would be seen not as a prelude to collapse, but as a final articulation of sovereign endurance. She held her ground against internal rebellion, economic strain, foreign manipulation, and imperial expansion. Her strategies were not always successful, but they were always intentional. She rarely reacted out of desperation. Even in the most precarious moments, she chose, and her choices, whether misunderstood or misrepresented, belonged to her alone. There is something uniquely powerful in that kind of agency, particularly when placed in contrast with the systems that sought to absorb her. Rome, for all its greatness, was rigid in its hierarchy. Its version of order required conformity. Cleopatra, by contrast, ruled through balance between cultures, between languages, between myth and state. She did not simply represent Egypt. She embodied its complexity, its capacity for fusion without dissolution. That she continues to be spoken of, debated, and reinterpreted today is not an accident. Her story, however overlaid with invention, continues to resist simplification. She cannot be neatly slotted into the categories preferred by empire. She was not the harlot Rome wished her to be, nor the goddess her followers imagined. She was a ruler, and she was a woman, and she was mortal, and she chose to live in the space between those truths, with eyes wide open. If your eyes are fading, let them. The story wasn't waiting for anyone. In the centuries that followed Cleopatra's death, her physical world gradually disappeared, but the shadow of her name stretched further than any monument ever could. The palaces of the Ptolemies, once the jewel of Alexandria, eventually succumbed to earthquakes, fires, and rising seas, vanishing beneath the harbor's surface. Like the final breath of a story too vast to preserve in stone alone. The columns cracked, the statuary sank, and yet her story endured not because of preservation, but because of reinvention. What has remained, more persistent than architecture or empire, is the mythology she left behind, a myth that was never static, but constantly rewritten to serve the purposes of those who invoked her. This transformation was not simply the result of artistic fascination or political necessity. It was born of something deeper, something unsettling, an inability to contain what she represented. Cleopatra was not remembered because she fit neatly into the categories of her time, but because she defied them. She was not admired for being one thing, but for being many things at once, ruler and mother, strategist and symbol, seductress and scholar. Her complexity became her permanence. During the Imperial Roman period, she lingered awkwardly in the public imagination. Augustus, as the founding emperor, ensured her portrayal remained narrow and cautionary. She was invoked in mosaics and frescoes as a cultural warning, the woman who had led noble Antony astray, the foreign queen whose charm cloaked danger. Yet even in these depictions, there was an unmistakable tension. The art never quite flattened her. The eyes of the figures they called Cleopatra looked too intelligent. The posture, too poised. The message may have been official condemnation, but the medium often betrayed fascination. In late antiquity, as the Roman Empire fractured and Christianity rose, Cleopatra's story mutated again. To the early church fathers, she became a figure of worldly corruption, indulgent, pagan, and dangerously feminine, and yet they could not ignore the allure of her agency. The sermons warned against her, but the faithful still whispered her name. Her story was too rich, too tangled in questions of morality, destiny, and resistance to be cleanly set aside. In the minds of many, she began to take on a metaphysical weight, not merely a historical person, but a representation of choices that challenged the inevitability of conquest. The medieval world, particularly in Islamic scholarship, would take another view entirely. While Europe saw Cleopatra through the lens of original sin and temptation, Arab historians and philosophers approached her as a figure of intellect. In works like the Book of the Categories of Nations, she was mentioned not for her romances, but for her wisdom. Writers described her as a patron of learning, a reader of stars, and a ruler with insight into the natural sciences. Alchemical texts were attributed to her. Mathematical instruments bore her name. She was framed not as a cautionary tale, but as an exemplar, a woman who had understood the workings of the world and ruled not with whimsy, but with mastery, even in this more respectful light. However, the historical Cleopatra remained elusive. She had become a symbol, and symbols, once loosed from the weight of evidence, begin to float. With each century, she drifted further from the woman who once stood at Alexandria's royal window, watching the sea for ships that carried news from Rome or Cyprus or Judea. Yet the drifting did not diminish her. It merely expanded the reach of her name. By the Renaissance, artists and humanists turned their attention back to antiquity. And with that came a renewed appetite for Cleopatra's story. But now, She was filtered through the prism of theatricality. She was dramatic, expressive, a figure of romance and ruin. Painters draped her in velvet and pearls, surrounded her with asp-bearing handmaidens and incense. Her suicide was no longer political resistance, it was spectacle. Yet within these lavish interpretations, a trace of her original strength remained. The drama, after all, was rooted in fearlessness. The iconography may have been exaggerated, but the essence of a woman choosing her own ending remained intact. Shakespeare, whose Antony and Cleopatra remains among the most influential versions of her tale, portrayed her with a mixture of passion and tragedy. Wisdom and caprice. His Cleopatra was at once sovereign and unpredictable, brilliant and volatile. Critics have long debated whether he understood her complexity or merely succumbed to stereotype. But what is undeniable is that she commanded the stage not as a secondary figure, but as the very center of conflict. She did not exist in his play to reflect Antony's choices. She was her own storm. In the centuries since, Cleopatra has continued to appear in literature, in film, in politics, in classrooms. Sometimes she is embraced, other times criticized. But always she returns. Her presence serves as a test of how we see women in power, of how we interpret ambition, of how we handle the intersection of politics and intimacy. To invoke Cleopatra is never to make a neutral statement. It is to invite questions about authority, gender, culture, and memory. And yet, through all these retellings, the real Cleopatra, the ruler who governed for more than 2 decades, who spoke with emissaries in their native tongues, who managed a kingdom threatened on all sides, often slips away. Not because she lacks evidence, but because she defies containment. She resists our need for clarity. And perhaps that is why she still matters. In an age that craves resolution and categorization, her story reminds us that identity is rarely singular, that power is rarely simple, and that legacy is almost never ours to decide. You don't have to carry this. Most of it didn't want to be remembered anyway. To revisit Cleopatra now, not through dramatization or ideological reframing, but through the layered texture of her lived experience, is to begin to understand why she has persisted so stubbornly in the cultural imagination. Her presence, even as it shifts form and tone across centuries, continues to reveal an uncomfortable truth about the nature of power, and especially about the ways women in power are remembered, rewritten, and resisted. In her lifetime, Cleopatra wielded authority over one of the most symbolically rich and strategically vital regions in the Mediterranean. She did so not as an anomaly, nor as a puppet of greater male figures, but as a highly capable, politically astute, and deeply pragmatic leader who engaged with the machinery of empire on her own terms. Her court was one of ceremony, certainly, but also one of substance. Cleopatra surrounded herself with scholars, diplomats, engineers, and legal experts, not merely as adornments of prestige, but as essential instruments of statecraft. She did not isolate herself in myth, despite the divine associations of her role. Rather, she enacted divinity as a mechanism of legitimacy, a bridge between the Ptolemaic lineage and the much older rhythms of Egyptian sovereignty. Her identification with Isis was not delusion, but performance, crafted with a clear understanding of how religion could unify a culturally divided realm and stabilize a fragile throne. It was, in many ways, a masterstroke. While Rome postured through republican austerity and masculine militarism, Cleopatra drew upon older, more fluid systems of power systems that valued wisdom as much as strength, continuity as much as conquest. She ruled through presence, through ritual, through strategic affection, and calculated distance. She was not attempting to mirror Rome, nor to oppose it blindly. She was trying to hold space for another kind of empire, one where lineage and legacy were balanced with nuance, where language and ceremony could wield influence equal to legions and fleets. This balancing act was neither effortless nor abstract. It required continuous adaptation, the kind that leaves little room for rest. Cleopatra, far from being a monarch who coasted on inherited grandeur, spent much of her reign navigating immediate crises, revolts among the nobility, food shortages along the Nile, diplomatic tensions with neighboring kingdoms, the volatile mood of Rome's Senate, and the shifting loyalties of generals and governors. Every letter she sent, every coin she minted, every alliance she forged was shaped by the delicate knowledge that her margin for error was narrower than that of her male counterparts. Her ability to maintain stability in such conditions for over 2 decades speaks not just to resilience but to strategic brilliance. Yet this brilliance has often been either diminished or rerouted into the language of romance. The partnerships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, though undeniably intimate and personal, were also deeply political. Each served a function within the broader project of preserving Egypt's autonomy in the face of Rome's increasingly global reach. Cleopatra was not blinded by love. She understood the stakes. Her liaisons were not escapes from power, but attempts to reconfigure it. And while her final stand with Antony at Actium is remembered as a dramatic turning point, it was, from her perspective, one more calculated risk in a long pattern of tactical decisions. Had that battle turned differently, had Rome fractured just slightly more, had one more admiral stayed loyal, had the winds favored her fleet, history might have been forced to accommodate an entirely different chapter. That it does not reduce her strategy to folly. It merely underscores the brutal indifference of imperial ambition to anything but absolute submission. What becomes clear, especially when her life is viewed in its full political context, rather than through the veil of scandal or melodrama, is that Cleopatra's strength was not exceptional in the way most imagine. It was precise. It was cumulative. It was the result of tireless calculation and a steady hand in the face of unrelenting pressure. She was not an icon simply because she was beautiful or tragic, though history has tried hard to keep her in that box. She was an icon because she governed a realm that should have collapsed and managed to hold it together longer than anyone else could have. And in the end, when collapse was no longer avoidable, she did not allow herself to become the final exhibit in someone else's triumph. Her suicide, often rendered as melodrama, was instead a profoundly political act, a refusal to be paraded, humiliated, and used as a closing argument for Rome's moral superiority. By taking her own life, she denied Octavian his visual confirmation of conquest. Her death was not surrender. It was a carefully measured punctuation mark, a full stop placed precisely where she wanted the story to end. The fact that so many retellings have focused on the theatrical aspects of that death, the robe. The final gaze says less about her and more about the cultures that inherited her image. They wanted a queen who died for love, not one who died for dignity. They preferred a legend undone by passion to a leader who enacted her final moment as one last political decision. But in truth, Cleopatra's farewell was consistent with everything she had done in life, controlled, symbolic, and resistant to the narratives others tried to impose. Even now, as we attempt to reframe her, we often stumble on the same question: who gets to define her legacy? Is she the last pharaoh of Egypt, the failed lover of Rome's most reckless general, the scholar queen of lost Alexandria, or the mythic goddess whose death marked the twilight of ancient dynasties? The answer, of course, is all of these and none of them entirely. She remains like the Nile itself, a shifting presence. Her story curves around what we hope to find in it: caution, inspiration, romance, tragedy, brilliance, ruin, and perhaps that is why she has lasted. Not because her story is conclusive, but because it remains unresolved. She does not teach us how to rule or how to love. She teaches us how to persist, how to move through complexity without being devoured by it, how to act with intention even when the outcome is uncertain, and how to shape memory by refusing to let others speak the final word on your behalf. What if forgetting was never failure, just a softer way to hold weight? If Cleopatra's story continues to endure, and not merely endure, but evolve, provoke, and invite, it is because she represents a rare convergence of contradictions that human history is both fascinated by and deeply unsettled with. She was at once immensely powerful and profoundly vulnerable. A sovereign whose authority depended not only on lineage or military might, but on a nuanced understanding of performance, language, ritual, and perception. In an era when Rome was beginning to codify its version of civilization as the standard for the world, Cleopatra stood at the edge of that rising tide and offered a vision not of opposition, but of complexity. She was not Rome's antithesis, but its alternative, a reminder that empire need not be singular in its image. That she was ultimately defeated does not diminish the vision she represented. If anything, her downfall exposes the limits of the Roman model she was forced to navigate. Her Egypt was multicultural, multilingual, and spiritually pluralistic. It made room for ambiguity, for ceremony, for feminine power articulated not in imitation of masculine structures, but through its own framework of continuity, care, and symbolic integration. Cleopatra did not claim to be equal to her male counterparts by denying difference. She ruled by leaning into what made her distinct, and by doing so, unsettled the very foundations of Roman control. That discomfort is evident in the historical record, particularly in the way Roman writers grappled with her presence. Even when they sought to discredit her, their language betrayed a lingering awe. She was referred to as Regina Meretrix, the queen prostitute, an insult meant to strip her of dignity, but one that simultaneously acknowledged her capacity to command attention, shape outcomes, and wield desire as a political tool. That such rhetoric was necessary at all speaks volumes. Rome could not dismiss her through silence alone. They had to explain her, contain her, reduce her, and even then, they could not quite erase her. This failure of erasure is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her legacy. Most women in antiquity, even those of noble birth or extraordinary intellect, vanish into the footnotes of history. Their names, if preserved at all, appear only as appendages to the lives of men. Cleopatra is a rare exception, not because she lived outside of patriarchy, but because she navigated within it so effectively that her story could not be written without her. She was not an accessory to someone else's narrative. She was the axis around which multiple narratives spun: Egyptian and Roman, public and private, historical and mythological. Her ability to occupy that central space, and to do so with a kind of deliberate opacity, is part of why she remains so difficult to define. Even now, after centuries of excavation and scholarship, her motivations are often described as elusive. Was she driven by love, ambition, patriotism, or survival? The answer, of course, is yes, but not always in equal measure, and not always in ways that translate neatly into modern moral frameworks. Cleopatra was not a character in a novel. She was a human being in a position of extraordinary complexity, making choices that were sometimes brilliant, sometimes flawed, but always consequential. To revisit her life with this awareness is to move beyond the binaries that have so often constrained her story. She was neither saint nor villain, neither victim nor manipulator. She was a ruler who made choices in a world that afforded her few guarantees and many dangers. That she lasted as long as she did, that she shaped as much as she did, is not the beginning of a tragedy, but the measure of an achievement. In many ways, Cleopatra was a mirror, one that reflected not only her own time, but the anxieties and aspirations of every era that followed. Each generation has reinterpreted her according to its own preoccupations. To Enlightenment thinkers, she was a figure of decadence, a warning against the corruption of monarchy. To Victorian scholars, she was a moral aberration, her sexuality framed as both the source of her power and her downfall. To modern feminists, she is often seen as a symbol of agency, a woman who claims space in a world determined to push her to the margins. Yet none of these lenses can fully contain her. She slips past them, as she always has, refusing to be reduced always to a single theme or cautionary arc. Her endurance suggests that we are still reckoning with the questions she embodied. How do we define strength in a woman, and how do we respond to it when it does not resemble the strength we are used to? How do we tell the story of someone who combined authority with performance, beauty with intellect, romance with strategy, and death with dignity? And more pressingly, why have we spent so long trying to tidy up the life of a woman who clearly did not ask to be tidy? Perhaps the answer lies in our discomfort with stories that refuse to resolve themselves neatly. Cleopatra's life, and more importantly, her memory, is not a closed book. It is a palimpsest, rewritten again and again, never fully clean, never fully erased. We continue to write on top of her, even as the original lines bleed through, and in that process, we reveal something not just about her, but about ourselves, what we fear in power, what we expect from women, and what we choose to remember when the facts no longer serve our preferred conclusions. Even her death, choreographed as it was, remains a challenge to the narrative of control. Octavian may have won the war, but Cleopatra stole the final moment. Her suicide denied him the chance to reduce her to a spectacle. It interrupted the story he intended to tell. She exited not quietly, but on her terms, wrapped in ritual, witnessed by the only people she trusted, and refusing to be paraded through a city that had always viewed her with suspicion. That act was not defeat, it was punctuation, precise and unflinching. If the quiet held you longer than you meant, just say so. Even now, as the centuries unfolded and Cleopatra's name passed through the mouths of chroniclers, artists, scholars, and empire builders, what persisted was not a fixed image, but a fluid echo, one that adapted to the needs, fears, and desires of every age. No matter how tightly successive empires tried to define her, she always managed to elude final judgment. Her story bent and twisted, was pulled in opposing directions, and yet continued to resonate, not simply because of what she did, but because of how little she allowed others to do on her behalf. That insistence on authorship, on presence, on deliberate choice became the thread that held her legend together, even as the fabric changed form. In many ways, Cleopatra became more powerful after her death than she had ever been in life. Not through any conscious effort of legacy planning, but because the very ambiguity that frustrated her opponents created a fertile ground for myth. To those who saw her as a threat, she had been a manipulator of great men, a destabilizing force dressed in silk and perfumed strategy. To others, she emerged as a sovereign undone not by error, but by the brute force of a world unprepared for her form of governance. And to later generations, especially in times of political flux, she symbolized resistance, not the kind made from battle formations, but the resistance born from refusing to conform to the structures imposed upon you. That resistance was never loud. Cleopatra did not shout against her adversaries. She did not issue grand manifestos or wage campaigns of revenge. Her opposition was more unsettling. She endured. She watched. She adapted. She entered rooms where she was expected to perform a certain role and, instead, subtly changed the nature of the script. Whether in the Senate chambers of Rome, in the temples of Egypt, or aboard a gilded barge along the Cydnus River, She remained something Rome could not quite decipher, a woman who played the game better than most of the men in it, without appearing to follow its rules at all. The legacy of that endurance is perhaps clearest in the women who came after her, not necessarily in bloodline, though Cleopatra Selene, her daughter, would go on to rule Mauritania and bring aspects of her mother's culture into new lands, but an archetype. The idea of the intelligent, politically savvy woman who refuses to apologize for her ambition owes more than a little to Cleopatra. So too does the image of feminine power that does not disguise itself as masculinity, but which dares to be strategic, sensual, and cerebral all at once. This is no small thing. Across cultures and centuries, such models have remained rare, and when they appear, they are often immediately placed under the kind of scrutiny reserved only for those who cross the lines of what power is supposed to look like. That Cleopatra continues to be debated so fiercely today, her ethnicity, her intentions, her decisions reveals that she is not yet finished. We are still writing her, still trying to figure out whether she fits our current understandings of strength, of agency, of legacy. Some see her as a feminist icon, others as a tragic cautionary tale. Some focus on her relationships, others on her governance. Some want to reclaim her image for African heritage, others to place her firmly within a Greco-Roman lineage. Each of these efforts is a kind of archaeology, not just of history, but of meaning. And through it all, the woman at the center remains just out of reach, not because she was vague, but because she was never just one thing. We tend to forget that most historical figures are flattened by time. What survives of them are fragments of few recorded speeches, a name carved into stone, a battle whose outcome determined a map. But Cleopatra, despite the propaganda, despite the destruction of her city, despite the biased accounts written by her enemies, remains textured. She has survived not as a statue, cold and distant, but as a presence that continues to demand interpretation. That is an achievement rarely afforded to those on the losing side of empire. There is a moment, sometimes, in the museum or in the pages of a well-worn book where her gaze catches yours from a coin, perhaps, where her nose is slightly hooked and her chin firm, or from a line in a play where she declares, with both pain and pride, that I am fire and air, and in that moment, she is not ancient, she is not legend, she is not even dead. She is simply present, still whispering across the centuries, not for attention, but for recognition. Not every ruler earns that kind of afterlife. There is something haunting in the realization that a woman who lost everything, her throne, her country, her lovers, her children's inheritance, has still managed to outlive her conquerors in the realm that matters most to the human psyche memory. Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, builder of temples and roads, architect of imperial structure. His name became a month, his achievements inscribed in monuments across continents. And yet it is Cleopatra, not Augustus, whose story has been told in every major language, whose image continues to be reborn in every new medium, whose very name still carries the weight of empire and the shape of a question. What do we do with a woman who did not vanish? Even now, when her name is invoked in lectures, in films, in literature, it carries with it a density that belies the simplicity with which many have tried to define her. She is not easy. She was not meant to be. She was a scholar who played politics better than her generals, a mother who orchestrated ritual with the precision of a mathematician, a lover who used proximity not to lose herself, but to reposition her world. And above all, she was someone who recognized that history, even when written by others, could still be influenced by how she exited the stage. Her story does not end with tragedy, nor does it conclude with glory. It lingers slow, soft, unresolved, because it was lived with too much intention to be reduced. That lingering presence is what gives her story its emotional depth. It is not the grand gestures that define her legacy, but the cumulative weight of a life spent walking the thin line between survival and sovereignty, between performance and authenticity. And if something in here found you first, say so. Just once. To reach the end of Cleopatra's story is to arrive not at a finality, but at a kind of suspended resonance, the sense that her life, though chronologically complete, has not concluded in the way history normally demands. Her name persists not as a relic, but as a recurring presence, echoing through art, politics, philosophy, and culture. Her image has been reshaped, misused, elevated, and challenged. Yet through all the iterations, she remains distinctly herself, not a passive subject of narrative, but a continual agent in her own myth. This kind of legacy is exceedingly rare. Most historical figures, particularly those who lose, are remembered in fragments, usually interpreted by those who overcame them. Cleopatra, however, refused to be defined solely by her defeat. Her death was not accompanied by a dramatic confession or the flourish of tragic regret. Instead, she slipped from the stage with the same deliberate composure that had marked her reign. She made no appeal to Rome for mercy, no final speech to her people asking for remembrance. She left behind no dramatic testament to her pain or her love. What she did leave in action, in structure, in silence, was enough to endure. What remains of her is complicated. The truth of her political genius sits beside the inventions of romantic mythology. The intellectual who corresponded with philosophers is placed alongside the theatrical queen of stage and screen. The ruler who governed Egypt with remarkable steadiness during a period of constant instability is frequently overshadowed by portrayals that reduce her to a figure of exoticism and seduction. And yet, even these distortions cannot sever her from history. They only underline the intensity with which she captured the imagination of those who came after her. In the centuries since her death, there has never been a time when Cleopatra disappeared entirely from the conversation. During the Enlightenment, she was cited in discussions about the perils of emotion in politics. In the 19th century, she became a muse for painters exploring the sensual and the sublime. In the 20th, she reemerged in cinema dressed in gold and eyeliner, made into both spectacle and symbol. In the 21st, she is studied again with renewed care, her leadership reevaluated, her cultural identity reconsidered, her actions placed within the broader context of post-colonial discourse and feminist theory. Each of these resurrections tells us more about the world invoking her than about Cleopatra herself, and yet they do serve a purpose. They remind us that power, especially when exercised by women, is always contested, always interpreted with a level of scrutiny that exceeds what is applied to men. Cleopatra's story has often been co-opted as a mirror for collective anxieties about female agency, cultural hybridity, and political ambition. The unease she produced in her Roman contemporaries has never entirely dissipated. It has simply evolved into new forms. To think of her now, from the vantage point of more than 2,000 years, is to be reminded of how legacy is formed, not by the details of a single act or the verdict of a single voice, but by the accumulation of presence over time. Cleopatra remains because she was never one-dimensional. She ruled through intellect and intuition, displayed strength in subtlety, and crafted narratives that could rival those of the empires that sought to consume her. She understood that to survive politically in a world increasingly hostile to independence required more than defense. It required storytelling, not lies, but myths, lived into being. That talent, more than any military alliance or romantic entanglement, is what preserved her. She wielded narrative as deftly as she governed territory. And when the time came to surrender the throne, she surrendered nothing else. Not her dignity, not her privacy, not her control. In her final days, she orchestrated her death with such deliberateness that it continues to unsettle even those who admire her. We want to know what she felt, what she feared, what she whispered in the final moments. But she did not leave that part of the story to us. She kept it, and in doing so, retained something that Rome, for all its reach, could not take. This is perhaps her greatest legacy, the idea that sovereignty is not simply about dominion over land or people, but also about dominion over self. In life, Cleopatra ruled Egypt with complexity and care. In death, she ruled her story with finality and grace. And in what came after the echoes, the arguments, the endless retellings, she ruled through the inability of others to let her go. That legacy still shapes how we think about power. It influences the kinds of questions we ask about those who stand at the intersection of politics and identity. It challenges our assumptions about what strength looks like, what authority requires, and what history truly preserves. And most of all, it reminds us that memory is not a neutral process. It is a negotiation, one that Cleopatra began before her enemies could finish their version of events. You've heard enough for now. Let the story finish itself without you. And if you're still awake, maybe the silence felt less alone this time. This was Boring History Nights. Until next time, drift softly and stay.